The nets vanish into Aegean darkness, like secrets swallowed by water that remembers every betrayal, every act of resistance, every moment when the powerless discover they possess weapons that the powerful never learn to recognize. Konstantinos Mylonas pays out the last section of his grandfather's fishing net, the one woven with techniques that predate written history, strengthened with modifications that transform traditional fishing equipment into something that German naval manuals have no words to describe, no protocols to counter, no experience to predict. 300 meters of hemp and iron, carefully weighted, strategically positioned, invisibly deployed in patterns that look like accident to anyone who doesn't understand how Aegean currents move, how underwater rocks create specific flow patterns, how fishing nets can become traps when arranged by someone who learned to read water the way priests read scripture. Tonight, the net carries more than hope for tomorrow's catch. Tonight, it carries the accumulated fury of a people who have watched their islands transformed into military installations, their fishing grounds patrolled by enemies who navigate these waters like tourists following maps drawn by strangers. The German patrol boat approaches with the mechanical confidence that superior technology breeds in minds that confuse equipment with intelligence, firepower with wisdom, military training with actual understanding of the sea that Greeks have been working for 3,000 years. The crew scans the horizon through night vision equipment that reveals everything except the most important detail: that they are entering water where tradition has become weaponized, where ancient knowledge has been transformed into modern warfare by fishermen who understand that survival sometimes requires turning your profession into your resistance. This is October 1943. The Aegean Sea has become a chessboard where German naval forces attempt to control island-to-island movement, prevent resistance coordination, intercept supply runs that might support partisan activities throughout the Greek archipelago. Their patrol boats sweep through traditional fishing grounds with the systematic thoroughness that military minds apply to problems they believe can be solved through adequate surveillance, sufficient firepower, and the kind of technological advantage that makes indigenous knowledge seem quaint, primitive, irrelevant to modern strategic requirements. But the sea belongs to no government. Water recognizes no political boundaries, acknowledges no military hierarchies, responds only to those who understand its moods, its patterns, its tendency to punish arrogance with the kind of swift justice that technology cannot prevent and superior numbers cannot overcome. The German patrol crews navigate these waters with GPS coordinates and sonar equipment, but they lack the generational knowledge that allows Greek fishermen to read currents like genealogies, to predict weather from wave patterns that appear identical to untrained eyes, to set nets in configurations that seem impossible to anyone who learned fishing from textbooks rather than grandfathers. Konstantinos learned his trade from men who survived Turkish occupation, Italian invasion, and now German administration. By understanding that powerlessness is often disguise rather than reality, that traditional knowledge can become tactical advantage when applied with sufficient creativity and desperate courage. His grandfather taught him to read water depth from surface color, to predict fish movement from barely perceptible current changes, to set nets that caught not just fish, but also the unwary boats of those who assumed that superior firepower guaranteed safe passage through waters that belonged to people whose families had been fishing here since before Rome learned to build ships. The patrol boat Seeadler displaces 240 tons, carries twin diesel engines capable of 32 knots maximum speed, mounts 20 mm anti-aircraft guns and machine gun positions that provide devastating firepower against surface targets foolish enough to challenge German naval superiority in occupied waters. Her crew of 18 includes experienced naval personnel who have patrolled these waters for 8 months, who know the locations of major Greek fishing villages, who understand the tactical importance of preventing coordination between resistance cells that use fishing boats for transportation, communication, and supply operations that support partisan activities throughout the occupied territories. What they do not understand is that their knowledge comes from maps drawn by cartographers who never lived on these waters, from intelligence reports compiled by analysts who never learned to read the signs that experienced fishermen use to predict weather, navigate safely, and avoid the underwater hazards that have been claiming careless ships since before written history began recording maritime disasters in these particularly treacherous waters. The Germans know where the major rocks are located, where the charted shipping channels provide safe passage, where their patrol routes should keep them clear of navigational hazards that appear on official maritime charts prepared by competent hydrographic surveys. But Konstantinos knows where the unmarked rocks hide just beneath the surface, where underwater currents create deceptive calm that conceals dangerous turbulence, where traditional fishing wisdom has identified hazards that never appeared on any chart because the men who discovered them passed their knowledge through oral tradition rather than written documentation. This knowledge, accumulated through generations of fishermen who learned from dangerous experience rather than safe theory, becomes tactical intelligence when applied by someone who understands that traditional fishing techniques can be modified for purposes that their creators never imagined. The net configuration that Konstantinos deploys violates every principle of efficient fishing that his grandfather taught him, but it satisfies every requirement of an underwater obstacle course designed to ensnare vessels whose crews navigate by instruments rather than instinct, who trust technology more than they trust water that has been testing human judgment for millennia. The net extends not in the straight lines that maximize fish-catching efficiency, but in complex curves that follow underwater topography, invisible to sonar equipment calibrated for military rather than fishing purposes. Each section of the net serves multiple functions. The surface elements appear to be normal fishing equipment, properly marked with floats that comply with maritime regulations, positioned in locations that seem logical for someone attempting to catch the kind of fish that frequent these waters during October. But below the surface, the net extends far beyond normal fishing depths, anchored to underwater rock formations in patterns that create what amounts to an invisible maritime maze, a subsurface obstacle course that becomes lethal when encountered by vessels moving at patrol speed through water that appears clear and safe to crews who learned navigation from instruments rather than intuition. The weighted sections of the net settle into underwater valleys that channel current flow in ways that amplify the trapping effect when something large becomes entangled in the hemp mesh that has been reinforced with salvaged steel cable, strengthened with techniques that transform fishing equipment into maritime engineering capable of stopping vessels many times larger than any fish the original net was designed to catch. The anchoring system uses natural rock formations rather than conventional fishing weights, creating attachment points that can withstand forces far exceeding anything that normal fishing operations would generate. But the genius of Konstantinos' design lies not in its strength, but in its invisibility. From the surface, the net appears to be conventional fishing equipment deployed by someone who understands local fishing conditions but poses no threat to military vessels with sufficient power to cut through any obstacle that traditional fishing might accidentally place in their path. The German patrol crews have encountered fishing nets before, have learned to navigate around them or, when necessary, to cut through them with the kind of routine efficiency that superior technology makes possible when dealing with primitive equipment that lacks the sophistication to present serious challenges to modern naval operations. What they have never encountered is fishing equipment designed not to catch fish, but to catch them. Nets positioned not according to fish behavior, but according to patrol boat navigation patterns, traditional equipment modified with modern materials, and deployed according to principles that combine ancient fishing wisdom with contemporary understanding of maritime warfare. The net that awaits the Seeadler represents the weaponization of traditional knowledge, the transformation of cultural heritage into tactical advantage by someone who understands that resistance sometimes requires turning your profession into your weapon. The approach happens exactly as Konstantinos predicted. The German patrol boat follows its established route through waters that previous patrols have found clear and safe. Navigation that relies on charts rather than local knowledge. Tactical procedures that assume superiority of equipment over experience. The crew maintains standard vigilance appropriate for routine patrol operations in waters where previous encounters have involved only fishing boats and small craft that present no significant threat to well-armed military vessels with overwhelming advantages in speed, firepower, and technological sophistication. At 2147 hours, the Seeadler encounters the first section of Konstantinos' net at a speed of 18 knots, sufficient velocity to ensure deep entanglement before the crew realizes they have contacted something more substantial than conventional fishing equipment. The initial impact feels like normal net contact, the kind of minor obstacle that patrol boats encounter regularly when operating in waters shared with civilian fishing activities. The standard procedure involves reducing speed and maneuvering to clear the entanglement without damaging either military equipment or civilian property that might belong to local fishermen who cooperate with German administration. But this net does not behave like conventional fishing equipment. Instead of parting under pressure or sliding clear with proper maneuvering, the hemp mesh tightens around the patrol boat's propellers, hull fixtures, and deck equipment with the kind of systematic efficiency that suggests design rather than accident, purpose rather than coincidence. The steel cable reinforcements that Konstantinos wove through the traditional hemp create attachment points that distribute stress across the entire net rather than allowing localized failure that would permit easy escape from what begins to feel less like accidental contact and more like deliberate entrapment. The patrol boat's twin diesel engines, designed to provide rapid acceleration and high-speed maneuvering in tactical situations, become liability rather than asset when their power serves only to tighten the net's grip, to increase the mechanical advantage that the anchoring system provides, to transform the vessel's own propulsion into the force that drags it toward underwater rock formations that will complete the destruction that the net has begun. The crew's training for combat situations proves inadequate for dealing with an obstacle that responds to increased engine power by becoming more dangerous rather than less effective. Captain Klaus Weber orders reverse engines, standard procedure for clearing entanglements, but the net configuration anticipates this response. The backward thrust that should free the patrol boat instead draws it deeper into the mesh maze that Konstantinos designed specifically to defeat this exact countermeasure. The steel cable sections that provide structural integrity for the modified fishing net create purchase points that prevent the kind of clean separation that normal fishing equipment allows when contacted by vessels with sufficient power to break free from accidental entanglement. The anchoring system begins to demonstrate its engineering sophistication as the patrol boat's struggles create tension that transfers mechanical force through the net to underwater rock formations selected specifically for their ability to withstand enormous stress without shifting position. The rocks that serve as anchor points have been tested by centuries of winter storms, have proven their stability against forces far greater than any single vessel can generate, have been positioned by geological processes that created natural mechanical advantages that human engineering can exploit but cannot duplicate. Within 10 minutes of initial contact, the Seeadler has become completely immobilized, her propellers fouled beyond any possibility of mechanical clearing, her hull so thoroughly entangled in modified fishing net that cutting free would require equipment and time that the tactical situation does not permit. The crew's recognition that they have encountered not accidental fishing equipment, but purposeful maritime trap triggers combat alert procedures. but their weapons prove useless against an enemy that consists entirely of hemp, steel, and rocks, deployed by someone who understood exactly how their patrol patterns, their navigation procedures, and their tactical training would respond to this particular challenge. The dragging begins when underwater currents that Konstantinos mapped during years of fishing, these waters start moving the helpless patrol boat toward the rock formation that will complete the trap he spent months designing. The net configuration that seemed insane to anyone who understood conventional fishing proves to be sophisticated maritime engineering when evaluated according to criteria that prioritize vessel destruction over fish catching, tactical success over fishing efficiency, resistance effectiveness over traditional equipment performance. The Seeadler begins moving not under her own power, but under the influence of current patterns that experienced local fishermen understand, but that German naval charts fail to document adequately. The underwater topography that creates these currents has been shaped by geological forces operating over millions of years, creating flow patterns that appear chaotic to anyone who lacks generational experience reading water movement in these specific geographic conditions. But Konstantinos learned to predict these currents from his grandfather, who learned from his grandfather, who learned from men whose knowledge of these waters extended back through centuries of fishing, trading, and surviving by understanding forces that no amount of formal education can substitute for direct experience accumulated across generations. The patrol boat's helpless drift toward destruction occurs with the mechanical inevitability that precise engineering creates when natural forces are harnessed through adequate understanding and careful preparation. The crew's desperate attempts to cut free from the net fail because conventional tools prove inadequate against fishing equipment that has been modified with materials and techniques that transform traditional hemp into something approaching maritime cable, something designed to restrain forces far exceeding anything that normal fishing operations would generate or that standard naval equipment anticipates encountering in these waters. The rock formation that serves as the final element in Konstantinos' trap has been carved by wave action into shapes that concentrate destructive force with the efficiency that only geological processes can achieve. The underwater spires and hidden ledges that will shred the patrol boat's hull were shaped by thousands of years of storms, creating natural ship-breaking equipment that human engineering cannot improve, but human intelligence can exploit when applied with sufficient understanding of local conditions and adequate preparation time. At 2203 hours, the Seeadler strikes the rocks with enough force to breach her hull in multiple locations, the impact amplified by her own momentum and the current patterns that continue pushing her against underwater formations designed by geological processes to destroy anything that approaches them with insufficient caution or inadequate knowledge of local navigational hazards. The patrol boat that seemed invulnerable when armed with superior firepower and modern technology proves helplessly fragile when trapped by equipment that costs less than a single artillery shell but has been deployed with tactical sophistication that exceeds anything her crew was trained to anticipate or counter. The destruction occurs with spectacular efficiency. The patrol boat's fuel tanks rupture against rocks that tear through metal designed to withstand combat damage, but not the concentrated force that geological formations can focus when ships are driven against them by currents that amplify impact velocity and direct destruction toward the most vulnerable structural points. The explosion that follows illuminates the night sky with flames visible from neighboring islands, announcing to resistance fighters throughout the region that superior technology has been defeated by superior knowledge, that traditional wisdom has been weaponized successfully against occupying forces who assumed their equipment advantages guaranteed tactical superiority in all circumstances. The crew's survival depends entirely on their ability to reach shore before hypothermia or drowning claims them. But even their escape becomes part of Konstantinos' larger tactical plan. The survivors who reach the beach carry with them the knowledge that Greek fishing boats pose threats that their training never prepared them to recognize, that traditional equipment can be modified in ways that transform routine patrol operations into lethal encounters, that local knowledge provides tactical advantages that technological superiority cannot overcome without cultural understanding, that occupying forces rarely possess and never develop quickly enough to prevent the kind of innovative resistance that desperation breeds in people who understand their homeland better than their enemies ever will. The news of the Seeadler's destruction spreads through resistance networks with the speed that hope travels when transmitted by people who have been waiting for evidence that occupied peoples possess weapons that occupying forces cannot anticipate, cannot counter, cannot defend against without understanding cultural knowledge that requires generations to accumulate and lifetimes to master. Fishing communities throughout the Mediterranean begin experimenting with similar modifications to traditional equipment, discovering that their professional knowledge contains tactical applications that military experts never considered because they learned warfare from textbooks rather than from grandfathers who understood that survival sometimes requires turning your life's work into your weapon. German naval patrols throughout the Aegean immediately changed their operational procedures, avoiding waters where fishing nets might be deployed, requiring additional escort vessels for routine patrol operations, implementing detection equipment designed to identify underwater obstacles before contact occurs. But these defensive measures reduce patrol efficiency, limit operational flexibility, and require resources that could otherwise be dedicated to offensive operations against resistance targets that multiply faster than occupation forces can track or eliminate them. The tactical impact extends far beyond the loss of a single patrol boat and crew. The psychological effect on German naval personnel proves nearly as significant as the material damage, introducing uncertainty into routine operations that previously seemed safe, forcing consideration of threats that military training never addressed, requiring tactical planning that accounts for the possibility that traditional civilian equipment might be employed in ways that conventional military analysis fails to predict or prepare for. But the strategic implications prove most important for resistance movements throughout occupied Europe. Konstantinos' success demonstrates that traditional knowledge can be weaponized against technologically superior enemies, that cultural heritage contains tactical resources that formal military training overlooks, that occupied peoples possess advantages that occupying forces cannot develop without becoming indigenous themselves, a transformation that defeats the purpose of occupation while creating the cultural understanding that makes resistance impossible to prevent or predict. The fishing net that destroyed the Seeadler becomes template for similar operations throughout the Mediterranean, adapted to local conditions and traditional knowledge that each fishing community possesses about their particular waters, their specific geographic advantages, their traditional equipment that can be modified according to principles that Konstantinos discovered through desperate creativity and careful observation of enemy patrol patterns. The weaponization of fishing equipment spreads through coastal resistance networks like a virus that infects traditional knowledge with military applications, transforming every fishing boat into potential weapon platform, every net into possible trap, every fisherman into tactical asset whose cultural knowledge provides strategic advantages that no amount of military training can duplicate or counter effectively. Years after the war, when military historians analyze the tactical innovations that resistance movements developed against technologically superior occupation forces, Konstantinos' fishing net modification appears in textbooks as example of asymmetric warfare that exploits cultural knowledge advantages, demonstrating how traditional wisdom can be adapted for military purposes that defeat technological superiority through superior understanding of local conditions, terrain advantages, and environmental factors that outsiders cannot master, without becoming insiders. A transformation that eliminates the cultural distance that makes occupation possible while creating the indigenous knowledge that makes resistance inevitable. The principles that Konstantinos discovered through desperate innovation prove applicable far beyond maritime warfare. The concept of weaponizing traditional knowledge influences resistance tactics throughout occupied territories, inspiring similar adaptations of cultural heritage for military purposes that exploit intimate local knowledge against enemies who possess superior equipment, but lack the generational understanding that allows indigenous peoples to turn their homeland itself into weapon against invaders who navigate by maps rather than memory, who fight according to doctrine rather than instinct, who understand warfare as profession rather than survival skill that cultural heritage has been preparing them to employ since childhood. The rocks that destroyed the Seeadler remain unchanged, carved by geological forces that continue operating according to principles that predate human warfare by millions of years, shaped by processes that will continue long after human conflicts become archaeological curiosities studied by civilizations that may understand the futility of trying to control peoples who belong to their landscape in ways that invaders can never duplicate or eliminate without destroying the cultural knowledge that makes the land worth controlling in the first place. But the memory persists in fishing communities throughout the Mediterranean, passed down through families who understand that their traditional knowledge contains tactical resources that formal military training cannot anticipate or counter, that cultural heritage provides weapons that technological superiority cannot defeat without cultural understanding that transforms invaders into inhabitants. A change that eliminates invasion while creating the indigenous wisdom that makes resistance unnecessary because it makes occupation impossible to maintain without becoming the culture it seeks to control. The net that seemed insane to anyone who understood conventional fishing proved to be sophisticated engineering when evaluated according to criteria that prioritize tactical success over traditional efficiency, demonstrating that innovation often emerges when traditional knowledge encounters desperate necessity, when cultural heritage meets existential threat, when people who know their homeland intimately discover that their knowledge contains weapons that their enemies never learned to recognize, never thought to fear, never prepared to counter. If stories like this remind you that cultural knowledge contains tactical resources that technological superiority cannot overcome, that traditional wisdom provides weapons that formal military training never anticipates, then perhaps there are other moments when desperate innovation transformed cultural heritage into tactical advantage, when people who seemed powerless discovered they possessed knowledge that made them invincible on ground. They understood better than their enemies ever could.